In all of media, every genre has a moment where it splits. A moment where a formula becomes a philosophy. For roguelikes, that split happened before most people even encountered one, and strangely, one of the clearest reflections of that split came from a game that hardly anyone played. It didn't redefine the genre, it didn't influence a new wave of developers, and it didn't become a cult classic. What it did do, quietly, was offer a preview of what roguelikes would eventually evolve into, and almost everyone missed it. To understand why, we need to go back to the beginning, to the very moment roguelikes formed, and to the very moment they fractured. Roguelikes are a fascinating component of gaming culture, built on an almost masochistic need for exploration, challenge, and problem-solving. Roguelikes are a style of RPG traditionally characterized by a dungeon crawl through procedurally generated levels, turn-based gameplay, grid movement, and permadeath. But it's a little more than that, isn't it? Many titles feature some or a good number of these high-value factors, but not all. Introduced in the 1980s and pioneered by computer hobbyists and universities, roguelikes were beloved for their complexity, innovation, and boundary-pushing technical creativity. From silly little text characters on the screen to represent the world, to beautiful graphics and fluid animations, roguelikes have had an impressive evolution over the past 40 years. But there's a problem. An identity problem. Nobody can really define what a true roguelike is. Some people say it's all about the vibes, that roguelikes are this mythical blend of various elements that can't be distilled down to a formula despite many efforts to do so. Others will say that it comes down to how much of a very specific set of mechanics and limitations exist. A few efforts have been made to solve this problem, and as a heavily opinionated girl on the internet with too much time on her hands, I think I have an idea. But before that, I want to take you through the history of roguelikes, tell the genre's story, and take a detailed look at an obscure, forgotten gem from the Dreamcast era that may have predicted the very state of the genre today. It all began in the 1980s when Michael Toy and Glenn Wickman, and later on Ken Arnold, published the namesake of the entire genre, Rogue. Inspired by a previously published game called Colossal Cave Adventure, or Adventure, Rogue would push the limits of what people had come to expect from an RPG. It used ASCII graphics, letters and symbols to represent monsters, walls, and treasures, a necessity of the era that became the roguelike's visual signature. It was difficult, punishing, and very rewarding. Unlike other RPGs, Rogue just drops you right into the action. No character creation, no class selection, and no stat attribution. Your character is predefined, ready to dive into the dungeons of doom. The game had simple controls, yet were alien by today's standards. HJKL were used for movement, QWE were used for various actions, and many more. This seemingly archaic setup would soon be translated to the numpad in later editions. The game is turn-based, meaning the player takes their turn, and then all entities on the board act on the following turn. Move onto the same tile as a monster, and a combat simulation will run. If your stats are sufficient, you'll win the fight. If they're not, you lose. And what happens if you lose? Game over. No, seriously, that's it. The entire game resets. There's no reloading your last save or checkpoints. If you die, that's the end of the run. Time to start over. If that wasn't enough, victory meant finding the Amulet of Yendor deep in the Dungeons of Doom and bringing it back to the surface, a nearly impossible task for most players. All of this for an RPG in the 1980s was enough to grab the attention of early gamers, players enthralled by its intensity, complexity, and unforgiving challenge. While Rogue became the namesake of the genre, an earlier game would actually beat it to the punch. The first roguelike, ironically, was Beneath Apple Manor for the Apple II computer, published in 1978, but it had the misfortune of not being published on ARPANET, unlike Rogue. As such, Rogue would simply become the more popular and well-known game to attribute to this exciting new genre. Future games would iterate, such as Hack, NetHack, Adom, Moria, and Ongbond. Each of these were made with the intention to expand upon what Rogue had brought to the table. Developers would create many different forks within the genre, focusing on different aspects of the game design. As the years went on, the genre would develop a cult following and receive high critical and popular acclaim with the RPG fandom. The skeleton of a classic roguelike boiled down to three things: dungeon crawling, procedural generation, and permadeath. While this is an oversimplification, we'll soon discover how these games came to be the non-negotiable traits of a roguelike. To do that, we're going to talk about a game, a tiny, mysterious, forgotten relic of the past that may have been one of the first attempts to bridge the genre from its position as a subcultural niche to a universally recognized game genre for a mainstream audience. As the roguelike genre evolved, developers from other corners of gaming began applying its ideas: procedural dungeons, unpredictable risk, and the finality of loss to their own creations. By this point, fans had already established a rigid definition of roguelike, but almost as soon as it solidified, it began to blur. Other titles experimented with the format, introducing central hubs, secondary progression layers, and per-instance resets instead of total permadeath. These shifts came with the rise of home console gaming, where developers sought to make roguelike concepts more palatable, less punishing, more forgiving, and better suited for casual play. One example often discussed on this platform is Baroque, a surrealist horror RPG that stitched roguelike systems onto a console framework. Although often cited as the first 3D roguelike, Baroque remained obscure outside Japan until its PlayStation 2 and Wii remakes nearly a decade later. That's why I won't be too surprised if some of you have heard of, or even played, the subject of today's video: Time Stalkers. Released on the Dreamcast on September 15, 1999, and published by Climax Entertainment, Time Stalkers, also known as Climax Landers in Japan, was a crossover game featuring several IPs and characters from other Climax titles. It tried to capitalize on the JRPG boom alongside the sudden rise in demand for crossover games such as Marvel vs. Capcom 2. In Time Stalkers, you control the titular character Sword, a cocky and arrogant swordsman who desperately tries to sell himself as a ladies' man, though usually unsuccessfully. He finds himself trapped in a strange Frankenstein world composed of several land masses taken from other worlds, which is explained by a mysterious character simply named Master as the result of a terrible curse that has befallen the land. Sword and others have been brought to this world as heroes to try and find the source of the curse and eliminate it to restore the world. Sword's character is awful. He's exactly what you'd expect a group of marketing execs to think is cool to 12-year-olds. Cocky, arrogant, sexually insecure, and constantly trying to convince everyone he doesn't care about anything at all ever. Other characters in the game are similar in that they're one-dimensional. On its surface, Time Stalkers isn't much to look at. Literally. The graphics aren't that great even by the standards of the time, the characters are bland at best and insufferable at worst, and the writing, whether it's due to poor writing or poor localization, is just bad. But we're not here to look at those things, no. We're here to look at the game's design DNA. What is at the core of the gameplay? How do we interact with the systems and make choices? What about this game attempts to manifest fun, and how much rogue is it injected with? Let's dig in. Time Stalkers centers around a hub world filled with shops, NPCs, and various services. Even a home where you can store gear and trophies between runs. From here, you access a set of story-linked dungeons that unlock as you progress. Their entrances never move, but what's inside changes every time. Each dungeon is randomly generated whenever you enter, forcing you to adapt to new layouts, traps, and monster combinations on every attempt. Before entering, you can only bring a limited number of items. Once inside, you ascend floor by floor, scavenging for loot, avoiding traps, and battling enemies in turn-based combat. Character progress doesn't carry over. Every dungeon run starts from level 1, no exceptions. Your strength at the start depends on your title, which affects base stats, usable gear, and starting skills. There is a quick save option, but it functions more like a suspend state than a safety net. If you die, the save is erased, and you're sent back home, stripped of everything you gained inside the dungeon. In some cases, you even lose money or captured monsters. Beneath all of this sits a complex stat system that governs how effectively you can wield weapons and equipment. And layered atop it all is a unique twist: monster taming. Using the capture ability, you can recruit enemies to fight beside you, forming an evolving party across separate playthroughs. These systems make Time Stalkers one of the earliest console RPGs to genuinely translate the spirit of roguelikes for a wider audience, a bridge between the hardcore procedural worlds of the 1980s and the more forgiving hybrids that would follow in the 2000s. But before we talk about how Time Stalkers might have predicted the future, we need to take a step back into the past. Let's start with the namesake of the genre. Rogue was developed in the early 1980s by Michael Toy and Glenn Wickman, with later contributions from Ken Arnold. Originally built for Unix mainframes, Rogue wasn't something the average home computer owner could easily play back then. Accessing it often required being at a university lab or having very hobbyist-level computer literacy. Thankfully, today there's a widely available DOS version on the Internet Archive that you can play right now in your browser, and that's the version I used for this video. The moment you press start, Rogue wastes no time. There's no cinematic intro, no tutorial quest, nothing holding your hand. You choose a name, the game drops you into a dungeon, and you begin. If you need help, the only guidance comes from a couple of reference screens, one explaining the controls, and one explaining what the symbols on the map mean. Rogue's presentation is famously minimal, using ASCII characters that represent the player and other entities on the screen. Despite how simple it looks, there's already a surprising amount of depth here. Many items, especially scrolls, start out unidentified. Their effects are unknown unless you either use them or find a scroll of identification. So right away, the game presents you with risk, curiosity, and decision-making. In my run, I embraced chaos and just used whatever scrolls I found. Sometimes this backfired, but sometimes it paid off big, like revealing the entire floor map so I could loot efficiently. There are weapons, armor, consumables, hunger mechanics, potions, and each of these play into resource management that grows more tense the deeper you go. Combat is turn-based and determined by probability checks, basically digital dice rolls. If neither side dies in a trade, both units remain in place and act again on the next turn. You gain experience by killing enemies, leveling up increases your health and combat ability, and death means game over with no continuation. You start again. No exceptions. I only ran one playthrough for this segment, but I made it a few floors deep before getting cornered by a particularly nasty cluster of enemies in a hidden room. One wrong move, and the run was over. And here's the thing. I immediately understood why this game captivated so many people. Rogue is pure curiosity given form. Every floor is a question mark. Every item is a gamble. Every step is potentially the one that spells disaster. Even with plain text visuals, the core loop speaks directly to the adventurous parts of our brains. Rogue would go on to be ported to DOS and released commercially by Epix in North America and Mastertronic in Europe. Its popularity inspired countless successors, some using Rogue's original codebase, others starting from scratch, but all trying to capture the same cocktail of mystery, danger, and discovery. So based on these early formative games, we can summarize classic roguelike design around a few core pillars. This is a very strict interpretation of what counts as a roguelike, and as the genre evolved, it became increasingly difficult to draw clean boundaries. As more games experimented with the formula, especially outside the ASCII PC space, fans needed a clearer definition, which leads us to the first major attempt to academically define the genre. The Berlin Interpretation. Drafted in 2008 at the International Roguelike Development Conference, this document lists the features that must be present for a game to qualify as a roguelike. It's rigid, sometimes controversial, but foundational to how we talk about the genre today. The document lists a number of high-value and low-value factors that must be present in a game to qualify it as a roguelike. To understand this document, we're going to break it down line by line so we understand the framework we're working with here. Starting with high-value factors, the first is random dungeon generation. It clearly defines that the world should be randomly generated, with placement of items and monsters also random. This was indeed a core element of what made roguelikes of the time so fun and engaging, allowing for infinite replayability. But something that sticks out to me immediately is that it doesn't define exactly how much of the game needs to be randomly generated to qualify. Modern roguelikes often feature procedurally generated dungeons, but connect those dungeons to a fixed hub world for the player to start from. Does this disqualify a game from being a roguelike? Some would say yes, and others could argue no. In this case, the Berlin interpretation is both rigid and unclear in its nuance. I want you to keep that in mind. Next, permadeath. The interpretation says that death must be permanent and results in the player starting over from the first level. Saving is allowed, but only as a break. The save is deleted upon reloading, meaning one cannot save scum their way through the game. Again, this is very true for the first games, but future games would start tinkering with this a little bit. Some games would handle death by basically eliminating the run upon death. That means losing our items and levels, and having to start over from nothing on our next dungeon run. But your character and core unlockables still remain intact. This is what I refer to as a secondary progression layer, and we'll talk more about that as well. Turn-based gameplay on grid tile maps is listed as a high-value factor as well, but the document also states that the game is not sensitive to time. The interesting thing about this requirement is that almost no modern roguelike meets it at all. If you say roguelike to someone today, most people are going to think of Noida, Hades, and Cult of the Lamb as modern popular examples, and these games are certainly sensitive to time, as standing around is just going to get you killed. And what about games with real-time movement but turn-based combat? Do these apply? To what degree must a game be turn-based? This section fascinates me because of just how little it actually clarifies and defines. But there's no denying that this was in fact present in every classic roguelike, leading up to this document being drafted. Next, the document states that the game should be non-modal. Let's unpack the term modal here. What they're referring to is a type of design style in which your game is separated into many different modes. A prime example of this is what I just said, a real-time movement mode and a turn-based combat mode. The document states that every action in the game should be able to be performed in the same game mode. but then immediately list ADOM, Ongbond, and Crawl as violations. It is unclear if they are mentioning these as exceptions to the rule, or if they're immediately disqualifying these games as roguelikes. Of course, I doubt there are many people who would not consider any of these games roguelikes in some capacity. The next part is actually my favorite component of the entire document. It states that the complexity of systems present should result in emergent gameplay. Emergent gameplay is the gradual rise of complex situations in games that emerge from interacting with simple game mechanics. There are many examples of this, but a very easy example to understand is Minecraft, and the absolutely insane contraptions people build with Minecraft using simple blocks and tools the developers created. This is a part of the interpretation I agree with immensely. What makes the original Rogue so fun for me isn't just the random generation for replayability, but how that randomness results in countless unique gameplay situations to react to. The genius of this level of design is that you don't need to directly craft the choices the player will make. The game's systems will provide the player with choices naturally. This is one thing I wish I touched on a bit more in my Atlas video when discussing how older MMOs worked. Emergent gameplay can surprise a game's very creator by allowing players to come up with unique solutions that the developer might not have even thought of. This is incredibly rewarding to both developers and players. The only gripe I have with this section of the document is that it states it's strongly connected to having only one mode, but it's entirely possible to have emergent gameplay arise from having multiple modes and systems in your game, as long as you design each mode with emergence in mind. Next, we have resource management. This is admittedly bare bones. It just states that the game should have resources the player will have to carefully manage. Pretty simple stuff. We don't need to spend too much time here. Lots of games have resource management in some capacity. But the next section we have is called hack and slash. Though that term has an entirely different meaning in today's gaming world as a whole. Rather, we can look at this section as stating that combat is essential to progress, without peaceful or pacifist options. This is true. You need to fight enemies to become stronger in order to survive against tougher and tougher foes as you progress through the game. Could an argument be made that a roguelike could use an Undertale-like approach where defeating an enemy involves making peace with them? Most certainly, and I think it'd be an interesting experiment for someone to try. Next up, exploration. The game must feature careful exploration of dungeons with the discovery and usage of unidentified items. While I understand why they included this here, I have a bit of a problem with the way they mention and include items here. It sounds like they're taking a core game system, navigation and exploration, and combining it with the game's inventory system. While there's no denying that these two features go hand in hand with the game's overall experience, I don't think the presence of an inventory system is required to really make a roguelike in the first place. Now, these are the high-value factors. So now we're going to jump into what the document lists as low-level factors. I'm going to keep it brief, as they're quite minimal and generic, but seek to explain some of the smaller microsystems present that give roguelikes their unique identity despite not being unique to the genre itself. The document lists the first of these as controlling a single character through one playthrough, which disqualifies traditional party-based RPGs outright. Secondly, monsters have behavior that is similar to the player character. They can only move once per turn, and are held to the same standards as the player during combat. The document also states that the game should provide a tactical challenge. Dungeons should be composed of a series of rooms with connecting corridors, and the status of the player should be represented with numbers in the form of stats. This is why I started the video by labeling a roguelike as a style of RPG, because it leans on these low-level factors that are present in nearly all RPGs. Now, that's what the Berlin interpretation says, but how did we get here? Let's take a journey through history and see how a strange Unix dungeon crawler acted as the singularity to an explosive big bang of a genre that is as diverse as it is complex. Initially popular with computer programming hobbyists and universities, Rogue and its subsequent iterations were influenced by a game from 1975 called Colossal Cave Adventure. Developed by William Crowther in 1976 and Don Woods in 1977, Cave Adventure was made on a PDP-10 mainframe computer and featured cave exploration and looting as its core mechanics. The game is sometimes shortened to simply Adventure or Advent, and is purely text-based, separating it from the roguelike genre that would seek to incorporate actual player movement and on-screen graphics. The only real ingredient that Colossal Cave Adventure had was permadeath, though this would go on to be one of the defining features of the entire roguelike genre. Despite Rogue becoming the namesake of the genre, it actually wasn't the first game to fit the formula. That honor belongs to an Apple II title known as Beneath Apple Manor, released in 1978 and written by Don Worth, published by the Software Factory. While Beneath Apple Manor and Rogue only had 2 years between their respective releases, both developers of the games have stated they were completely unaware of the development of the other game. Some say Rogue became more popular because it was deeper, more complex. Others say that it had a unique advantage in being distributed on ARPANET, an early precursor to the internet made by the US Department of Defense to connect to research institutions and allow for information sharing. We already know how much of a penchant early computer researchers had for making games with spare computing resources. Perhaps that's a topic for a whole other video. Shortly after Rogue, in 1982, Jeff McCord would contribute to the genre with Sword of Fargoal. The game was built from an earlier title by Jeff called Gamma Quest, but I wasn't able to find any remnant of it, meaning its source code and the game itself was likely never widely released, and maybe lost media. In Sword of Fargoal, you play as a warrior exploring various dungeons in search for the titular artifact. Similar to Rogue, it features randomly generated dungeon maps, enemies, and items to loot. Difficulty scales with progression, and the game included permadeath. In true Rogue fashion, once the artifact is found, the player must then escape the dungeon within a time limit in order to achieve the victory condition. Many games would evolve from Rogue and its sister titles. These include Hack, NetHack, Adom, Moria, Angband, and Tales of Maj'Eyal, to name a few. Think of this point as a branching stage. Each iteration differs and offers forks in the overall design philosophy, focusing on different elements. Fork is a fitting term here, as many roguelikes sprouting during this era were actually made from Rogue's original source code. The roguelike community separates some of these early games based on what games they're most directly or most likely iterated from. Moria-based games were inspired by Rogue and used its original source. Moria was built off of Rogue by adding complexity alongside a persistent overworld. In fact, this would spawn the term Moria-like in some communities, since the presence of a persistent overworld separated it so dramatically from Rogue's true 100% randomly generated style. However, a persistent overworld or hub world would soon become a defining feature for how we understand roguelikes today. A popular title in this style was Angband, created much later in 1990 by Alex Cutler and Andy Astrand. These developers wanted to expand upon Moria, which was a prominent Moria fork. It increased the number of levels and monsters and, like Moria itself, was inspired by Tolkien's high fantasy fiction. As a side tangent, you might notice that I'll refer to several forks and spin-offs in this video, and that's because, during this time, there were just so many. There were countless forks during this time, enough that mapping the entire family tree would prove to be a near Sisyphean task. What's important for you to know is that at this point, the genre was accelerating, splitting, and evolving quickly. Next is hack-based. Hack was a roguelike released in 1982 by Jay Fenlison, Kenny Woodland, Mike Tome, and Jonathan Payne. It stayed true to the original D&D influences, deriving its name from being a hack-and-slash game and also a programming hack. Hack would seek to recreate Rogue without actually having access to its original source code, a process we now call reverse engineering in the software world. While Hack would be moderately successful, it was eventually dropped in favor of NetHack in 1987, developed by Mike Stephenson, who took maintainership of Hack's original source code. NetHack featured a wider variety of monsters, used predefined levels with some procedurally generated elements, and contained optional player-based quests. This is where the genre began to negotiate between tradition and accessibility. Ancient Domains of Mystery, or Adom, by Thomas Biskup, was derived from concepts of NetHack and created from scratch with the aim of creating more story-driven gameplay in the genre. Several different procedurally generated dungeons connected to an overworld, facilitating events for stories and quests. Adom itself also introduced a unique mechanic in the form of player mutation. Your character could actually pick up mutations throughout the game, randomly providing you with negative or positive effects. Write this down as a textbook example of promoting emerging gameplay because it's solid gold. The game reacts to the player as the player reacts to the game. Moving past the mid-80s, we have Larn, released in 1986 by Noah Morgan. Larn would borrow concepts from both Hack and Moria and included a fixed time feature in which the player had only so many turns to complete a specified task. Next up, in the late 80s, Lawrence Brothers, that's the name of a single individual, not a pair of brothers, would introduce and solidify the overworld concept of roguelikes before Adom with Omega. Omega was unique in its inventory system, requiring players to pick up an item into a held state before having to manually move said item into a bagged state. While I didn't mention this in the Forcadia video, those who were particularly eagle-eyed or have played the game might notice this feature was partially present there. A player could hold a single item in a slot designated on their character. The 90s would give us Adom, and the mid-90s would grace us with Lindley's Dungeon Crawl, released in 1995 by Lindley Hensel. It featured a skill-based character progression system. Experience could be used to improve specific skills, such as weapon proficiency or trap detection, instead of relying on predetermined growth curves. This put a lot of power in the player's hand for how their character would develop. something that would be adored by classic RPG lovers throughout the decades. Arriving at this stage in our journey, you may have noticed something. By the mid-90s, roguelikes began to evolve sharply, separating into numerous forks and splits based on what features they prioritized. More importantly, some of these games I mentioned here already deviate in dramatic ways from some of the high-value factors listed in the Berlin interpretation. Again, keep this in mind because we're going to be revisiting it. Before we do, though, and I know roguelike fans watching this video have been patiently waiting for it, we need to dive into the series that many believe changed the genre forever and went on to define it as we know today. Mystery Dungeon. By the time we reached the 1990s, the roguelike genre had evolved into many forks and variations as they approached the modern day. Attempts would be made to bring the roguelike genre, once very niche, into the mainstream home console gaming audience. Of these were Sega's Fatal Labyrinth and Dragon Crystal in 1990. These games lacked the depth of typical PC roguelikes and neither proved very successful, but they're important to note as precursors to the Chunsoft era and the release of Dragon Quest. While not a roguelike, Dragon Quest would inspire Chunsoft to take elements of the roguelike genre and fuse it into Dragon Quest, with the creation of Torneko no Daiboken, Fushigi no Dungeon, in 1993. Fushigi no Dungeon, based on Dragon Quest, offered several methods to reduce difficulty from its earlier roguelike ancestors. Firstly, permadeath is now an option, not a requirement. Secondly, scaling difficulty was introduced. The game starts off as easy to pick up, and gets more difficult the more you progress. Fushigi no Dungeon proved successful enough to warrant future games, which would spawn the first of the Mystery Dungeon series, Shiden the Wanderer. From here, Chunsoft would go on to develop a whopping 25 additional titles in the Mystery Dungeon series. The lack of permadeath soon became a defining feature of Mystery Dungeon variants. The franchise was one of the first to fully adopt the secondary progression layer as we see it in modern titles. As far as consequence for failure is concerned, your dungeon progress is reset upon death, but your character and its progression are not lost. Means to restore lost items were also introduced, and procedurally generated dungeons would be incorporated into many other games and subgenres at this point. We're not just seeing the evolution of roguelikes, but also how other genres cherry-pick from the roguelike genre to enhance them. While Mystery Dungeon would start shaking things up in the East, computer games in the West were also evolving, becoming more graphically sophisticated, and it's at this very moment in time where we start seeing the defining classic roguelike elements of the 80s and early 90s disappear or become diluted. Newer games would introduce roguelike elements, but were vastly different experiences. This would spawn the term roguelite, a prominent example being Diablo. Diablo featured procedurally generated dungeons, dungeon crawling, and gratuitous violence as its mainstays, but lacked the true randomness, permadeath, and complexity of roguelikes. Meanwhile, existing roguelikes continued to be developed. Adon would receive a sequel in 2012, NetHack had a new release in 2015, newer titles like Dungeon Crawlstone Soup and Dungeons of Dreadmore would hit the scene in 2006 and 2011 respectively. Soon, the Coffee Break roguelike would enter public consciousness with titles like Doom RL Desktop and Desktop Dungeons in 2013. Released in 2006, Dwarf Fortress would use roguelike elements atop a construction management simulation, which would go on to inspire none other than Minecraft. Yeah, roguelikes brought us Minecraft. There are many other titles I could rattle off in this section, and I really want to, but the truth of the matter is that this genre was the crucible of just so damn much after the 90s that it would be a gargantuan task to create a full comprehensive history, and quite frankly, beyond the scope of this video. The point is this. The definition of roguelike becomes so muddy at this point that tools like the Berlin interpretation become insufficient and frankly, excessively purist for an industry that thrives off of creativity and innovation. I will mention some notable roguelites real quick, since they're important to note as we finally approach the main target of our analysis today. Indie developers in the 2000s would incorporate roguelike elements into their games, not because they were trying to make roguelikes, but because they were cool. Strange Adventures in Space by Digital Eel would bring randomly generated planets and encounters combined with permadeath to space exploration. Spelunky would become a wonder hit in the indie world, combining the deep gameplay of roguelikes with the ease and simplicity of a platformer. Faster Than Light, or FTL, in 2012 would actually go on to credit Spelunky as their influence for FTL. This would give rise to so many beloved titles, including Slay the Spire, Enter the Gungeon, Hades, and of course, Call to the Lamb, which I'd like to note is notoriously successful for weaponizing its aesthetic of whimsy and cuteness against its brutal gameplay and religious horror aesthetic. Phew, okay, that was a lot. I know, but thanks for staying with me through this dense section because it's so important to the title we're talking about today. I want you to take all of this contextual knowledge about roguelikes and the design philosophy that went into them as we begin talking about our primary subject, Time Stalkers. It's time to peel back the onion. So earlier in this video, we laid out the basic structure of Time Stalkers. Procedurally generated dungeon crawling from a persistent hub world where we control one character at a time, engaging in turn-based combat with monsters. Characters have two progression sets. There's monster taming, and central narrative connecting it all. Great. Let's get in the details. First up, basic controls. Analog sticks control movement and camera. There's a main menu button where you can view and modify stats and equipment, and the ability to interact with objects or NPCs. One thing I'll note about the controls of the game is that, like many games from this era, the camera is awful. It uses a semi-automatic camera with an option to somewhat manually manipulate the camera, but it just kind of results in you just fighting with the automatic camera, making movement and orientation kind of nauseating. While this is only mildly annoying during the dungeon crawling segments, it's especially egregious while navigating the hub world. The hub world is, of course, the main area you'll engage in inventory functions, managing captured monsters, accepting quests, shopping, and managing your inventory. This is also where you'll save your overall game progress when you're not in dungeons. The hub world is also the space in which the story events will take place. Dungeon crawls serve to basically provide progress tokens for advancing the story. Before starting a dungeon, the hub world offers you a sort of setup phase, where you can decide what monsters you want to bring with you, equipment, and choose up to 4 items to bring with you. Equipment here counts as items, so you'll have to decide if you want to prioritize initial strength or consumable items when you start your run. The amount of items you can carry will expand as you level up in the dungeon run. A quick note on equipment to just get it out of the way. Some equipment requires mastery in order to equip, and this is based on particular stat values, which we'll talk about later, but essentially what this might mean for the start of your run is this. You may not be able to use some gear effectively until you gain a few levels actually running the dungeon. And since your EXP and level progress resets after every run, this means that you'll be working around this limitation often. Earlier we mentioned title promotions, and depending on your title, it can affect your starting stats and abilities depending on the character you're playing. Yes, there is more than one playable character you can take control of in the game, but you'll only ever be able to control one of them at a time. Dungeons are randomly generated with a series of rooms and corridors. Each chunk of a dungeon may contain items, enemies, or traps. Using the X button on your Dreamcast controller, you can scavenge any orange chunks for hidden items or traps at the cost of some of your hunger meter. Green areas indicate areas that are entirely revealed, while orange areas indicate an area you have explored, but not all entities have been revealed. These are the areas you want to scavenge. Each dungeon has several floors, with the end of each floor containing a teleporter that will move you to the next floor. Upon reaching this teleporter, you're given a chance to spend skill points, change your party makeup, and review items and equipment. The fast save option is also here, which allows you to save the current run's progress and immediately exit the game. Upon reloading, the save is deleted. Enemies exist in real time in the dungeon, running around and engaging in preset behavior with their spawn zones. The placement of enemies is random and decided upon when the dungeon is generated, but new enemies may randomly spawn in various places as you navigate the dungeon. In order to initiate combat, the player has to interact with the enemy and start combat. Sometimes, enemies can become aggressive, meaning they'll chase the player down and initiate combat after closing enough distance automatically. The dungeon is cleared once all floors have been cleared, and the end boss is defeated. This means that it's actually not necessary to defeat all enemies in a floor to advance, but it's very much recommended you do so because you'll need the experience points to be as strong as possible to take on the boss. Combat is turn-based and somewhat tile-based. Each actor moves into a designated square on the battle arena in groups of 4. At times, you may be fighting multiple groups of enemies at once. These squares represent the current position of the actor on the board. Actors can reposition using movement commands if they have access to them. A standard turn-based battle menu allows the player to choose what actions to take for each member of the party. One interesting thing about the square tile system is that when you queue an attack, you're essentially attacking the square and not really the actor in it. This means that if an enemy uses a movement command to change position after you've already committed to attacking it, you may end up attacking an empty square instead of your preferred target. You can, in kind, leverage this against enemies by moving yourself. Combat options consist of attack, magic, skills, items, and defend. It's also possible to flee the battle from the defend menu, but doing so keeps the enemies on the dungeon map, and they may immediately re-engage in combat. Rewards for combat include experience points and item drops. Although EXP, states, and levels are reset at the end of the run, completing dungeons can result in a title promotion for the character and their allied monsters, which allows permanent access to new skills and abilities unique to that character. So even though the numbers reset, your knowledge carries over. The player learns how to think with the system. The stat system in this game is very complex. Each character has a set of primary stats such as health, mana, vitality, and hunger. These stats will be used heavily during dungeon runs. A character also has other stats that affect certain aspects of the game. These stats will affect everything from damage output to what equipment you can use. A third layer of stats that I call battle parameters also exist and are modified by the gear that you're wearing. The whole system is very esoteric in nature, likely incorporating many stats to increase the complexity of damage calculations. This is a game design tactic often used to make damage and healing more difficult to predict, control, or abuse. Players often use a number of terms for this: stat bloat, opaque design, complexity creep, anti-optimization, and noise injection, to name a few. However, I've coined my own little term for this called algorithmic obfuscation, to describe the act of intentionally making your game's calculations harder to reverse engineer. It's also important to note that every character and monster you play in Time Stalkers has unique starting stats, meaning each character will excel in certain playstyles more than others. The system is asking you to adapt, not optimize. By far, my favorite component of this game is monster taming. All monsters in the game, with the exception of bosses, can be captured and used in your party. This requires a free capsule the monster will be stored in. After capturing, you'll have to register them in the hub world, otherwise they may randomly vanish on you after completing a dungeon. If a registered monster dies, you'll be able to revive it for a fee in the hub world. Since you can only hold a certain number of monsters at once, collectors are going to have to utilize the monster sanctuary in the hub world to store monsters they don't plan on using so much, giving them the free capsules necessary to continue capturing new monsters throughout the game. The reason I love this feature so much is that every monster in the game has their own unique progression. They can earn titles like the player characters and have access to unique abilities that really make combat more interesting. This is what kept me coming back to the game as a kid. Every new monster I tamed gave me a sense of overall permanent progression between each dungeon run. So to summarize, we have a core gameplay loop of hub preparation, then dungeon crawling, boss battle, returning to the hub world for item storage and monster management, and repeat. Simple when we put it on paper, but in practice, the loop creates a dense network of decisions to make. This gameplay loop seeks to satisfy the dungeon crawler itch. There is not a wide overworld to explore, nor permanent character death, yet the structure and cadence of the gameplay loop mirrors many early roguelike experiences. Time Stalkers, while not commercially successful, took a genuine leap of faith and design ambition. In this sense, it was ahead of its time, but very arguably predicted the future for the current state of the genre, as outlined by many of the features that we just discussed. But let's test it. How does Time Stalkers stack up to other roguelikes? Can we use the Berlin interpretation to assess it? So, let's evaluate Time Stalkers using the Berlin interpretation, beginning with the high-value factors. You are not expected to win the game with your first character. You start over from the first level when you die. It is possible to save games, but the save file is deleted upon loading. The random environment makes this enjoyable rather than punishing. This partially applies. There are lasting consequences for death, such as lost items, money, and captured monsters, but the game does not completely reset upon death. Next, each command corresponds to a single action or movement. The game is not sensitive to time. You can take your time and choose your action. Again, this is partially applicable. Movement is done in real time, not turns, but then combat becomes turn-based. Next, the document tells us the world is represented by uniform grid tiles and that monsters and the player take up one tile regardless of size. Again, I'm giving this partially applicable. While not perfect uniform grid tiles, the minimap on the dungeon is clearly attempting to have some kind of grid to mark explored areas. Players and entities don't move on a grid, and I wouldn't exactly call the combat arena squares a grid either, but it is kind of a halfway point to a grid. On movement and modes, not applicable. Time Stalkers clearly separates exploration and combat in two distinct modes, which runs counter to the single mode principle emphasized in the Berlin interpretation. On the section for allowing emergent gameplay, we say applicable. The game features complexity in character builds, equipment choices, and elemental damage and weapon type damage. The random nature of dungeon progression also allows for any number of unique game states to play out every dungeon run. When it comes to resource management, we mark applicable. HP, MP, VIT, and hunger all have to be carefully managed to ensure success in the dungeon crawl segments, and you'll have to use replenishing items or healing shrines very carefully. Next to the hack and slash section, I'm going to say applicable. Combat is the means by which progress is obtained. Peaceful options don't exist, aside from simply trying to avoid combat, which is ill-advised. Next, the game requires careful exploration of the dungeon levels and discovery of the usage of unidentified items. This has to be done anew every time the player starts a new game. I didn't mention this before, but we can give this one a big fat applicable. Many of the items you find in your dungeon crawls may be unidentified, and can only be revealed using a truth fruit to reveal the item. This is something taken straight out of Rogue. For the low value factors, we're going to go through them quickly. Time Stalkers partially has the player control a single character, but the player can only control one main character at a time, and the party system featured in other popular RPGs are composed of tamed monsters rather than characters. I say we count it. Yes, rules that apply to the character also apply to the monsters that you fight. Yes, the game requires heavy tactical decision-making to ensure success. Yes, the game's focus is on providing tactical challenges. No, the game does not use ASCII characters to represent the game elements. Yes, Time Stalkers has dungeons made of rooms and corridors. And finally, yes, player state is denoted with a stat system. Tally it all up and we have 9 applicable, 2 non-applicable, and 4 partially applicable elements from the Berlin interpretation. The verdict? Time Stalkers is fairly roguelike. The game contains 50% of the high-value factors and many low-value factors, and yet many players wouldn't call this a roguelike. This suggests that the Berlin interpretation, while historically important, may not fully capture the design DNA that gives us these games their identity. There is a scathing rebuke of the Berlin interpretation written by Darren Gray of Games of Gray, simply called "Screw the Berlin Interpretation." I think we can gather how Darren feels about it. This piece basically states that the Berlin interpretation is out of touch, incorrect, and incredibly unrepresentative of the game's inherent diversity. Specifically, Darren absolutely shames the document for indicating ASCII characters as a requirement for the genre, and claims that it depends too much on aesthetics and setting to define a roguelike instead of gameplay and mechanics. That criticism is worth taking seriously. The Berlin interpretation emerged from a time when many of these design restraints were rooted in simple hardware limitations. In attempting to associate roguelikes with the genre's namesake, the Berlin interpretation uses a very strict criteria with little room for iteration. So when the Berlin interpretation treats those constraints as essential qualities, it risks equating the genre with the conditions of its origin, rather than the design behaviors that have endured across decades and across platforms. In that sense, the framework is historically valuable, but structurally incomplete. It's very good at describing where roguelikes came from. It's much less good at describing what makes them what they are. Sadly, we're pretty limited on alternative academic interpretations and tools. Some analysts have attempted to create a roguelike spectrum of sorts, but these were done mostly through an analytical lens in order to understand roguelikes. Notable figures like Game Maker's Toolkit and organizations like the GDC have spoken on roguelikes many times, but often through this analytical lens and not as an attempt to establish a classification or definition criteria. So if the Berlin interpretation can't tell us what a roguelike is anymore, how do we truly evaluate a game like Time Stalkers? Well, I've come up with something I call the Roguelike Classification Matrix. Its goal is simple. We take several design DNA segments and give them a weight score from 0 to 5. I'll be posting the full legend for this system in the video description, so you can feel free to use it yourself. The point of this system is to be slightly empirical while respecting the nuances of analysis. This framework allows for variation in interpretation, which is useful. It turns classification into dialogue rather than gatekeeping. The matrix will judge the following elements. Procedural structure. The degree to which games are algorithmically generated, affecting playthrough structure. Run-based progression. Whether a game is structured around self-contained runs with a success or failure restart loop. Irreversible failure. The degree to which failure resets the player's progress. Systemic emergence. The degree to which mechanics interact to produce unexpected outcomes. And finally, adaptation over accumulation, whether player improvement is based on knowledge and skill as opposed to naturally evolving character strength. We'll also acknowledge our own low-value factors on a case-by-case basis: turn-based versus real-time, grid versus freeform movement, and narrative continuity. This framework equips us with a few benefits. Firstly, we're attempting to distill roguelikes down to their DNA, the design elements and points of interaction that make them up. This matrix is not rigid. It allows and accounts for iteration and innovation within the genre, as well as allowing for dialogue as different analysts assign different values to different components. Finally, it also shines light on the roguelike genre's success as a collection of features. There are, however, some drawbacks. This framework's weighted value conditions, especially the mid-range values, are very subjective in nature. Different people may have different opinions on how much accumulation gain is present in a game. People with different tastes and difficulty may assign different values to run-based progression or irreversible loss. Secondly, this framework depends on a few initial assumptions, such as that design elements are what defines a genre and not how players interact with and interpret the systems. We're far more concerned about what's happening under the hood, and not what's going on in front of the screen. Thirdly, we're still relying on the primitive games of old as the basis for the roguelike structure. The only games that will really score a 5 out of 5 are the progenitor games, which still maintain some semblance of genre purity that only games designed over 30 years ago can realistically meet. Let me address each of these drawbacks. While the mid-tier gradients are somewhat subjective, this is by design and viewed as a strength. It allows for analysts to debate and refine their understanding of each system, rather than treating game boundaries as absolute. While the framework depends on initial assumption that the genre is defined by its design elements, that is precisely the point I'm making. Part of my thesis here is that comparing and analyzing games based on how a game behaves when played, as opposed to how it is experienced, gives us a more empirical foundation from which to draw conclusions. This is actually called formalism versus reception theory, and we're focusing on formalism. While the framework uses past and primitive games as a standard, much like the Berlin interpretation, this is because we're not setting out to redefine what a roguelike is. We're creating a model anchored in lineage, not hierarchy. We can think of the early games such as Rogue and NetHack as primitive organisms that mutate and evolve over time, and we use those common ancestors as a grounding point from which to engage in further analysis. So, let's plug Time Stalkers into this framework, piece by piece. Starting with procedural structure, I'm giving it a 3. The world contains a static hub with connected procedurally generated dungeons, and I feel that puts it squarely in the middle of the spectrum. For run-based progression, I give it a 4. The dungeons behave like self-contained runs, and while the game does maintain a persistent progress, story progress, and therefore game progress, the emergence of new features and things to do, is tied to a number of successful runs. Since dungeon runs are so critical to the game's flow, it's deserving of a 4. For irreversible failure, I rank it a 3. Death penalizes you. Your level is reset back to 1, and all experience and levels are lost. The only thing retained is your title, which determines available skills and some stats. All items are lost, and while you don't lose any equipped gear, it can end up broken. Allied monsters that have not been registered are also lost. I'd even say there's grounds to establish this as a 4, but I'll remain conservative on account that any equipped items are not lost. When it comes to systemic emergence, I also give this a 4. The game features several mechanics that interact: monster recruitment, resource management, equipment choices, character stat progression, damage types, and a magic system. But I consider the introduction of movement mechanics in combat another feature that results in emergent gameplay, as well as the introduction of vitality as a resource. When a player's vitality is reduced to 0, they're unable to deal significant damage. This may cause them to change their tactics and rely on magic, items, or movement strategies to reduce damage to themselves and try to edge out a victory. That's the very definition of emergence. Finally, for adaptation over accumulation, this scores highly with a 4 with a reasonable justification for a 3 depending on interpretation. While stat growth and resource management are seemingly at the forefront, the stat gains and level ups are really only there to keep the player at a minimal base strength for monsters in the higher levels of the dungeon. Your level alone won't be enough to pull you through if you can't manage your resources. Failure to understand the monster taming system will put you at a huge disadvantage. I really think it deserves a 4 here, but I would also understand anyone conservatively giving it a 3. For optional secondary factors, I have a few notes. For turn-based versus real-time, we have a mixed system, but I specifically want to note the presence of the position squares in combat, as well as the way map exploration works in a dungeon definitely breathe a lot of rogue life into Time Stalkers as a whole. I also want to note that while the game features largely freeform movement and lacks a grid system, the dungeons are clearly constructed with some level of uniformity and modular components. Finally, Time Stalkers features strong narrative continuity because the game is very story-heavy, but the story arcs are directly fueled by your dungeon runs. Several successful runs are necessary to advance the story. Overall, our Matrix is much kinder to Time Stalkers than the Berlin interpretation was, giving it a 3.6 rating or 72% roguelike. This shouldn't surprise anyone. Time Stalkers is clearly a roguelike in structure, but wrapped in the accessibility and console conventions of a typical JRPG. Returning to our evolution analogy, Time Stalkers could be looked at as a missing link between the classic roguelikes and the modern ones. Here's some examples of some other roguelikes I put through this matrix, and as a falsifiability test, I've thrown in some games that are definitely not roguelikes. Again, this framework matrix and its instructions will be posted in the video description, so you can see it for yourself. Alright, take a deep breath. We made it. It's the end of the video. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching and sticking through to the end. This was a very history and information-dense video, and doing the research for it alone was a massive undertaking. But this is my passion. I love talking about how games think, and how they make us think. So again, thanks for being here. Time Stalkers didn't do well commercially, but it was trying to do something genuinely bold, introducing roguelike structure to players who had never seen anything like it, and most people just weren't ready. Reviewers complained about the very things we now value: the resets, the stat complexity, the constraints that create tension and meaning. If you were expecting a standard JRPG, Time Stalkers probably felt confusing. But when you look at it with modern eyes, the picture changes. The hub world, the run-based resets, the persistent progression, the experimentation, that's today's roguelike formula. Time Stalkers was early, maybe too early, and that's why I think it's worth remembering. For now, roguelikes continue to evolve. Frameworks, definitions, and classifications are tools for understanding. They are not gospel. I personally feel it's important to be as empirical as possible when talking about game analysis, which is why I focus so hard on design elements. But I want to close with this. Rogue wasn't made because Michael Toy wanted to create a revolution in how we think about games. He made it because he thought it was cool. So many of the early pioneers of the game development world weren't chasing trends, poring over reviews, and replicating the success of other games. They were just making something to make something. Play for the sake of play. I think modern studios have largely missed the point. By attempting to commodify games and distilling them down to the bare-bones player-facing aspects, they end up obsessing over making something that's functional and profitable over just trying to make something fun. We need to make fun the point again, because when we do, we might just get to see another beautiful explosion of games on par with that magical era of the 1990s.